The Presidency unit begins today. Today we're going to cover the president, his powers and responsibilities, and on Thursday we're going to cover something that I think is far more interesting and something that I am actually trained in, and that is the administrative state. While I mainly study representation in Congress and rhetoric, as an American scholar, my minor field of study is public policy and public administration. Today is more descriptive than that. Federalist number 70. What's Federalist number 70 about? President is a big, strong boy. A strong executive ensures effective government. He argues that without an energetic executive, government is designed to fail. A weak executive means weak enforcement of laws, poor protection of liberty, and vulnerability to both foreign interference and domestic chaos. The big idea for you guys is that laws and institutions only matter if there's someone there to enforce them. I've already gone through and depressed you guys a lot with power doesn't really work in this idealistic way and parties really matter. The other kind of depressing notion I want to get across to you is that laws are essentially made up things that we all agree just exist. And without a strong guy up there, or a strong gal in theory, there's no way for them to actually exist in practice. He also argues that unity prevents conflict and indecision. He points to these historical examples, Rome being one of them, that when you have multiple executives, in the case of Rome, co-consuls, that creates division in the executive, and then indecision, and then poor execution of the law in the future. He has this quote. He describes the executive as benefiting and acting with decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch. And these qualities are best exemplified when vested in one person. A single leader ensures accountability in theory. While you have this person with all of this power vested in them so they can act, it also means that when they screw up, we know who to blame. And he notes that in the new Constitution, there are these structural ways that we can check those powers. They're checked through elections, through public opinion, and of course, even impeachment. But multiple executives make it too easy for one to hide behind the other. Hence why we have one strong, energetic executive. Broadly, he argues that presidents use public opinion strategically. Modern presidents rely on two tools to do this. Public appeals, that's the bully pulpit when you hear about it. They are a visible person in the government, and they're saying, we care about immigration, we're going to deport immigrants. Or, we care about immigration, we're going to bring them in because America's a melting pot. And also polling. Polling is basically a statistical method of going out and seeing what people think about certain issues, right? So this is a very old way of doing this, but you're sitting down for dinner, you get called up, hey, Joe Average American, we're going to sample 1,000 of you or whatever and see what you guys think about the Affordable Care Act. And then we're going to see how popular it is based on certain media frames and also different ways that we're going to talk about the legislation. Their ability to use public opinion then shapes public debate in turn. And they do this through what Canes-Wrone, I think Canes-Wrone is actually a she, and I apologize for that, calls involving the mass public, substantially increasing the influence of popular opinion and policymaking. This doesn't mean that the president blindly follows polls. Don't worry, you're still being ignored in government. Don't get too happy. Instead, they use the opinions strategically. For example, they're more likely to push forward into the public eye policies that they know are already popular, knowing that it boosts their chances to actually get those policies passed in Congress and also to win the next election. 2, mass appeals raise concerns of demagoguery, and I talked about this before. Historically, Canes-Wrone notes that leaders who cater to the polls more cater to short-term passions, which leads them to potentially making mistakes in the long term. The example that Canes-Wrone uses here is George W. Bush's creation of Homeland Security following 9/11. The public was, real up in arms about this, and they wanted action now, so he says, let's expand the security state. We have Homeland Security and then the Patriot Act, and nothing's private anymore. Key point here is that presidential appeals are like a double-edged sword. They enhance democracy by giving citizens a voice, right? So you are being listened to in some way, but they also can risk this kind of cheap populism where you are being talked down to or given what you want simply because your vote is valuable to them and they want to win the next election, rather than creating good policy that will help you in the long run. And finally, what I want you to note is that this influence depends on context. It's not constant. Responsiveness to public opinions is conditional and it is not uniform. While presidents usually move policy towards majority preferences in the country, they usually avoid endorsing popular policies they believe are harmful to long-term societal welfare, except under certain conditions. Those conditions being if their popularity is really bad or if they think they're going to lose the next election. They are more willing to act in a volatile way because of that. The presidency is both a representative institution, but also a strategic one because it's just one person. As Hamilton outlines here and as the Constitution allows, because it's just one person, they have all of the foibles of an individual person as well. Despite if we have an angel in there, right? You imagine someone who really wants to represent the public as best they possibly can, they're still going to do that imperfectly because they are just one person. Constitution Corner, we're going to go through real quick. Article 2, Section 1, what is it? Establish the presidency, term qualifications, etc. It's the vesting clause of Article 2. What's Section 2? Diplomatic powers. Section 3 requires the State of the Union, law execution, and some more of their diplomacy powers. What is the 20th Amendment? It moves the inauguration and also clarifies some of the succession questions. This is not the same as the 25th Amendment that is in the case of a president going under anesthesia or being incapacitated in some way. We'll go over that later. And what is the 22nd Amendment? FDR served for almost 4, and everybody was like, well, FDR was pretty cool guy, did a lot of cool stuff. Winning World War II is kind of a vibe, but also, what if we get a guy who doesn't like just up and die in office and just keeps going forever? Up until FDR, it was common practice that it was just kind of a norm for a president to only serve 2 terms, because that's what George Washington did. But, technically people could serve for as many terms as they want. Famously, Ulysses S. Grant contemplated running for a 3rd term, but that man had so much depression, I think that it would have killed him. The presidency. Let's talk about it. All right, let's review this real quick. So let's start with Article 2. The executive's power shall be vested in a president. Unlike Congress's powers that are herein granted, the wording of Article 2's vesting clause is a lot broader, and this then has fueled disputes over the scope of presidential authority. I go over this a lot in the video for Thursday, but I have to stress the unitary nature of the executive. Power is vested in a single president, not a council. The president then exhibits this power in 3 main categories. First are expressed powers. These are textual powers, like the ones we've talked about already, the veto and appointments. These are things that the Constitution says the president can and has to do. Then you have delegated powers. Those are authorities granted by Congress. For example, regulatory discretion and administering agencies. And third, you have the kind of vibes-based one, inherent powers, which are claimed powers by presidents that continue because of norms and precedent. These are executive orders, or war-making powers, and emergency actions. This I hope, gives you an idea that presidential authority is at the same time both structurally defined, but also incredibly elastic. I'm going to start with what I think is one of the most clear-cut powers that the president has, and that's military power. Obviously, we know that Article 2 names the president as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. However, historically, presidents have expanded this notion of Commander-in-Chief far beyond the framers' vision. The framers initially envisioned, George Washington, when they think commander-in-chief, kind of a tactical general. The ability to wage war and how we view wars has changed a lot over time. Here we have an image of some of our military presidents. You have George Washington, you have General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and that there is a young JFK when he served in World War II. The president can deploy armed forces. While Congress can declare war, only Congress can declare war, presidents have led basically every modern conflict. That's Korea, Vietnam, Iraq. All of these have been from presidential actions, not necessarily from Congress formally declaring war. The president can also mobilize the National Guard, both internationally and domestically, ideally during crises. The classic examples of these are during desegregation, when the National Guard was mobilized to allow black students to go to public school. Also, in natural disasters, Hurricane Helene comes through, and they send some National Guard down there to help with avoiding chaos and allow FEMA to do their job. We also see the National Guard deployed now in American cities for other crises. Case in point here, Donald Trump has argued that deploying the National Guard because immigration constitutes, in his mind, a national crisis. That's how he's justifying this. And also, the president can mobilize the armed forces with emergency declarations. This is one of the clearest areas where the practice of power has shifted from Congress to the president over time. The president does have some judicial powers. The president can forgive or lessen penalties. That's through reprieves. Those are delays in court proceedings. Pardons, which are individual forgivenesses of crimes. That's the most famous power. And amnesty, which is group forgiveness. I am a oppressed group, or I am a group that is being unjustly imprisoned, and therefore I ask the president to offer amnesty. These powers are unchecked by both Congress and the courts, though they can be politically controversial. The classic example of the most controversial presidential pardon of the last century is President Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon for all of his crimes associated with Watergate after he resigned from office. You also have Jimmy Carter pardoning Vietnam War draft dodgers simply because there were so many of them. This is one of the ways that a president can have a lifelong impact. It's kind of a legacy building action because it establishes not just, oh, hey, I got this person free, so they are loyal to me and they owe me a debt. It's also the idea that they can establish precedent for how we view laws. If the executive is the chief enforcer of law and they choose to not enforce certain laws, that says a lot. Probably wondering what these pictures are. The president also once a year on Thanksgiving pardons a turkey. They choose them from an American turkey farm and say, you don't have to be killed this Thanksgiving, and it is one of my favorite presidential traditions. The president, of course, has diplomatic powers, and diplomacy is a key presidential domain. You remember when we talked about how the head of state and the head of government are different things in some systems, like the parliamentary system in Britain, where you have the prime minister, who is head of the legislature and also head of government, and then you have the symbolic head of state and the King of England. The president here, because he is both, has diplomatic powers. Along with those diplomatic powers, George Washington expanded this notion of the power to receive ambassadors into recognition of foreign governments. A precedent that's still followed. A country doesn't really exist unless everybody else recognizes that they exist. Presidents negotiate treaties as well, but these require two-thirds Senate approval. This then leads to a greater reliance on executive agreements that bypass the Senate, but still carry treaty-like force. And finally, recognition and agreements underscore how presidents shape foreign policy with relatively few checks in the modern day. Again, Congress has allowed the presidency to take a lot of this foreign policy power on itself. There are, of course, executive powers. The Take Care Clause requires the president to implement laws, to execute them. This includes nominating cabinet officers, judges, and ambassadors with Senate confirmation, of course. Presidents also claim this thing called executive privilege. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about oversight hearings in Congress. And that's the right to keep internal communications confidential. That's central to cases like US v. Nixon historically. Nixon was paranoid and wanted to keep everything in-house. This then, of course, leads to these oversight battles in Congress, where Congress says that you are not being transparent with the American people, and the president says you can go shove it. The president is not, as the founders imagined him, a legislator. But the presidents still actively shape law almost as much, if not more so, than an individual member of Congress. Article 2 requires information sharing with Congress. The president must, from time to time, give Congress information on the state of the Union. State of the Union address is how that manifests itself. State of the Union historically has become this grand thing that presidents do. It's some of their most important speeches that they give. But if you look back in history, I'm pretty sure the first State of the Union that George Washington gives was like a few minutes long, and then he just, went home. The president can also recommend policies and budgets, trying to steer the agenda. But their most powerful tool is the veto power. We already talked a lot about veto politics. A lot of you guys have a cursory understanding of the veto pivot and pivotal politics from the congressional side, and it's pretty easy to understand how the veto is valuable to the executive from the other side of things. The president's main power when it comes to legislation is agenda setting. The president is ostensibly the leader of their party. Sure, the DNC and the RNC exist, but they are the head of their party. So, if, as we've established, power in Congress flows through the parties, and if the president is head of their party, they have a lot of discretion to dictate how leaders in Congress act and what they allow to come to the floor. They can do this through coordinating opposition if they are in divided government and organizing with the minority in Congress. They can also do this to try to funnel through an aggressive agenda if they are in charge of both the executive and the legislature. Let's talk about what some of these delegated powers are specifically. Delegated powers are when Congress transfers authority, transfers powers that it can't manage by itself. Those are creating agencies that operate under executive oversight, for example. Other examples include environmental regulation or workplace safety. And increasingly, Congress writes broad goals, leaving discretion to agencies and the president in how to actually implement the laws that they themselves write. This then blurs further the boundaries between the legislative and executive authority and enlarges the president's responsibility. As we've noted, the founders worried that the legislature would be this giant tyrannical body, that it's the most dangerous branch to them. So they put in all these checks and balances and separation of power, hence why we have all of this gridlock, and it acts slowly. But at the same time, they wanted a really energetic executive. They wanted them to be able to get out and do things. And that lack of balance between the two of them means that one is just much more positioned to get shit done than the other. The vibes-based one, inherent powers. Inherent powers aren't in the Constitution, but they're claimed through practice. War powers, I think, are the clearest example of this tension, too, right? So they're, one, a clear example of their codified structured powers, but what they've turned into is this kind of nebulous power that the president can do what he wants with. So Congress passed this thing in 1973 called the War Powers Act in an effort to limit unilateralism when it comes to conflict around the world. But basically, presidents since that passed have just ignored it and been allowed to by the court. Another inherent power that a president has is through legislative initiatives. They propose entire legislative agendas. And this was pioneered in the 20th century when we see parties start to come to the forefront of power yet again in this modern party structure that we have. Part of that is how, presidents run. They adopt their party platform, they're endorsed by the party, and it's a way of getting out their ideas, but also it increases this notion that we talked about with nationalization. It gets these few issues to float to the top, the cost of more local concerns. Executive orders are also kind of an inherent power. Executive order, for example, like President Truman's desegregation of the military, have the force of law, but are not in and of themselves laws. These are all more workarounds than actual authority that the president has. They're things that have come about over time rather than things that have been allowed through statute. Until the 20th century, Congress really dominated policymaking. This is what we call the legislative epoch. And it ends with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, depicted here in a very bold stance, with his New Deal. FDR's response to the Great Depression greatly expanded the scope of the federal government. Part of this was a goal to ensure that laissez-faire capitalism would no longer destroy the average American person. Part of it was also just to create new jobs for a vast amount of unemployed Americans. With this expansion of the federal government came an expansion of federal power and presidential power. That then has led to this interpretation that these powers that FDR created, these authorities, these agencies, are expected to be under the purview of the president moving forward. Because they come out of the executive after the legislative epoch, the president now has authority over this vast area of the government, essentially making, and you'll see this in a particularly resonant figure in the next lecture, the executive branch the largest branch. All of this leads to this notion of the institutional presidency. The presidency is now an institution. The cabinet heads 15 major departments, making up most of the government, and certainly most of the government that average people interact with. White House staff provides direct political and policy advice to the president. This currently is the chief of staff under President Trump, Susie Wiles, depicted on screen here. The executive office of the president, or the EOP, including the Office of Management and Budget and the NSC, that's the National Security Council, coordinates budgets and intelligence and administration of the government. Independent agencies and corporations, those are like the Fed and USPS, they're quasi-independent, operate at arm's length from the president, but still receive directives from the executive office. It's kind of crazy to think that we start with Alexander Hamilton arguing for a single energetic individual, and that spirals into a massive administrative state of more than 8,000 appointees and countless more career executives. I'm not a huge fan of my subtitle for this slide, I want to note. All of that is how presidents actually use power, but this is the most visible use of their power. Power rests for the president in party leadership. As I said, they are the leader of their party. They are the head honcho. And as we established, parties reign in the legislature. So if they're leader of the party in the executive, they appoint the Supreme Court judges, and the leaders in Congress look up to their guidance. Parties reign supreme here. They help coordinate these legislative agendas. They also exercise power through public appeals, going public, to pressure legislators or to test balloon some policy that they want to end up having passed. They're the most visible person in the American government, and from that, they have the bully pulpit, the ability more than anyone else to get across what they want to say. And finally, quietly, they have this broad swath of administrative tools, appointments, regulatory review, executive orders, and allows the president to then shape policy directly. Not necessarily through the structural design of their office, but merely through norms and practice. Next class, we're going to talk about that last one in intense detail.